The desert wind whispered through the brittle mesquite trees that bordered Redwood Hollow, carrying with it a silence so heavy it felt like the town had long forgotten how to breathe. Once alive with miners chasing silver dreams, the town now slumped like a drunk on a porch, worn out and watching the horizon for nothing in particular. Only the grit stayed, grit in the wind, grit in the teeth, and grit in the people who never left. Ellie Rhodes had stopped being noticed a long time ago. At 75, she lived at the far end of Juniper Lane in a sagging one-story house with flaking paint and a rusted wind chime that hadn't sung in years. People in town called her that cactus lady because she grew succulents in old soup cans and lined them along the porch railing. Most folks assumed she was a little off. No one checked in, no one called. But behind that weather-beaten door was a woman who had stitched up soldiers under mortar fire in Kandahar, who had once carried a wounded corporal on her back across an airfield. She knew pain. She also knew silence could kill in its own slow, strangling way. And now she shared her home with something that had started as love and rotted into fear. Tyler. Her son was 42, but looked older. Hollow-eyed, with a faded tattoo of a hawk on his forearm that he used to be proud of. Once, Tyler had wanted to be a pilot. Now, he couldn't even hold down a job at the local scrapyard. After his father died in a mining accident, something in him cracked. It started with skipping school, then shoplifting, then cheap liquor and card games behind the diner. By his 20s, he was already broken. Now he just existed, moving from the couch to the kitchen and back again, simmering with resentment. "You call this coffee?" he barked one morning, slamming the chipped mug on the counter. "It tastes like you boiled shoe leather." Ellie didn't flinch. "I can make tea instead." "I don't want damn tea, I want some respect in my own house." She didn't bother reminding him the house wasn't his. Only one person ever looked in Ellie's direction anymore. Jean Holloway, the widowed librarian next door. Jean kept a pair of binoculars on her kitchen windowsill, not for birds, but for habits. She'd seen the way Tyler slammed the screen door hard enough to knock planters over. She heard the shouting through the walls, but she always told herself, "That's family business, not mine." Then came the horse. It was early, just past dawn. The heat hadn't yet risen to its usual fever pitch, and the air still held a trace of morning cool. Ellie spotted it through her living room window. A Mustang, maybe, with a dusty brown coat and eyes that didn't belong to a wild thing. He stood under the shade of the pecan tree out front, perfectly still. Ellie stepped onto the porch with a dented metal bucket and slowly approached the edge of the steps. "Don't spook," she murmured, setting the bucket down and backing away. The horse watched her. Then, as if understanding, he walked to the bucket, drank deep, and lifted his head to meet her gaze. "Guess chivalry ain't dead after all," she whispered. The next day he returned, and the next. Each time, Ellie greeted him like an old friend. "Well, look who showed up again," she said one morning. "Guess you're the only gentleman left in this damn town." She began calling him Dusty, after the color of his coat and the way he seemed to drift in and out of her life like a ghost. Tyler didn't like Dusty. "What the hell is that animal doing out there again?" he growled, pacing the kitchen barefoot. "You feeding it. That's just asking for trouble." "He's just thirsty," Ellie said, stirring beans on the stove. "That thing's a curse. You watch, he's bad luck." "If anything's cursed around here," she muttered under her breath, "it ain't the horse." But she didn't say it loud enough for Tyler to hear. Not yet. Each night, Ellie would sit on the porch while the heat lifted off the pavement in shimmering waves. Dusty would show up as if summoned, standing at the edge of the yard. She didn't touch him. She just talked. About nothing. About everything. I used to dream of riding along the coast, she told him. Tyler promised me once when he was little, said he'd get me a horse and we'd ride to the ocean together. She held on to that memory like a prayer. She even kept the birthday card where he wrote it, folded and tucked into her nightstand drawer. The ink had faded, but the words still burned. That night, she sat with the card in her lap, eyes glistening. "One day, Mom, I'll buy you a horse," the child's handwriting said, "and we'll ride to the ocean like you always wanted." She touched the scar on her thigh, the one from the roadside bomb in 2009, and stared at her reflection in the dark window. "I survived bullets and bombs," she whispered, "but this is harder." At 1:06 a.m., Jean Holloway awoke to a sharp, echoing thud, then shouting, "You think you're better than me, huh?" Tyler's voice screamed. "You think that horse loves you more than I ever could?" She froze in bed, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling fan that spun too slow to move the fear away. She didn't call anyone. She never did. The next morning, Dusty didn't come. Ellie waited, sitting on the steps with the same bucket of water, now warm and dusty itself. Noon came and went. The horizon shimmered, but the tree remained empty. Young Eli McCoy, who lived 3 houses down, told his mother over lunch, "I saw the horse." He was standing on the hill all night, just staring at Miss Ellie's house. The boy's mother brushed it off. Kids see things, but Ellie felt it, the stillness, the waiting. That evening, she sat on the porch alone, the sun bleeding across the desert sky in reds and purples. "If tomorrow never comes," she said softly, "at least I had Dusty." Inside the house, Tyler stood behind the door, watching her. His jaw clenched, his fists tighter. Out in the yard, half hidden in shadow, Dusty stood silent. Still, watching too. The porch light flickered once, then went dark. The screen door creaked shut behind Ellie, and the steel bolt clicked into place. Tyler's shadow loomed over the kitchen table. Outside, the desert swallowed the last light of day, and Redwood Hollow held its breath. The days in Redwood Hollow bled into one another like spilled coffee on a faded tablecloth. The heat wave rolled in thick, blanketing the town with a kind of weight that made everything feel slower, heavier, meaner. It was the kind of heat that turned tempers brittle and sleep into a luxury. Inside the Rhodes house, it festered. Tyler had taken to pacing. Back and forth, through the living room to the kitchen, barefoot and shirtless, muttering under his breath. His eyes were darker now, hollowed out by insomnia, and a storm of thoughts that no one could see but that crackled just behind his teeth. Ellie had lived through war zones, operated under fire, but there was something about this kind of tension, the quiet, personal kind, that unsettled her more than mortars ever could. She kept to the corners of the house, moving silently, letting him have space. That used to work, but lately silence only seemed to agitate him further. One evening, she found him standing in the yard, shirt drenched in sweat, just staring at the spot under the pecan tree where Dusty used to stand. "You're waiting for that damn horse," he said without turning. "He's not coming back, you know. I made sure of that." Ellie's blood ran cold, though her voice stayed steady. "What did you do?" "I didn't hurt him, yet." He turned then, a smirk barely hanging on his face. "Maybe he just realized you're not worth the trouble." That night, Ellie locked her door for the first time in years. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the worn birthday card again, smoothing out the crease that ran across Tyler's childhood signature. She tucked it into the pocket of her nightgown like a talisman. In the kitchen, the refrigerator buzzed weakly, and the light above the sink flickered with every shift in voltage. Ellie stood and filled a glass of water, and as she drank, she stared at the window and the blackness beyond it. Somewhere out there, she hoped, Dusty was alive. Maybe he'd wandered back to the hills, but in her chest something said, no. She thought back to a different kind of silence, the nights after her husband died. Tyler had been just 12. Ellie worked the night shift at the urgent care clinic and cleaned offices on weekends. She remembered buying off-brand cereal and counting quarters at the gas pump. Tyler had asked once if they were poor. She'd told him no, they were just saving for a better life. He didn't believe her even then. Now, the bitterness had metastasized. It wasn't just disappointment, it was rage, sour and constant, and it was looking for something to burn. The breaking point came on a Sunday. It was late, well after midnight. The air was thick and unmoving, the kind of heat that made the walls sweat. Ellie had fallen asleep on the couch with an old fan pointed at her feet. Tyler's footsteps woke her. They were slow, deliberate. "You lied to me," he said, voice low. Ellie sat up, squinting. "Tyler, what are you talking about?" "You said life would get better, that we'd have a future, that I'd be a pilot. Remember that? You said to aim high, I did, and then you pulled me back down." "That's not true," she whispered. I never. You always held me back. You and your rules, your judging eyes, your disappointed sighs. Don't think I didn't notice." He moved closer. "You think you're some hero because you patched up soldiers? Big deal. You couldn't even fix your own son." Ellie stood, gripping the edge of the armrest. "Tyler, you're not well. Please, just sit down. We can talk." But he wasn't listening. "You'd rather talk to a horse than your own blood. You think that damn animal saved you? He didn't. He ruined everything." Ellie backed away, step by careful step. "You need help, Tyler." His eyes burned. "No, you need to be quiet, for good." What happened next unfolded like a fever dream. He grabbed her wrist with sudden violence, dragging her through the kitchen, out the back door, into the sweltering night. The ground beneath them cracked with dryness. The stars above offered no comfort, only distant, indifferent pinpricks. Ellie struggled, breath hitching, trying to reason with him. But Tyler wasn't there, not really. He was someplace darker. "You remember this spot?" he said, yanking her toward the far corner of the yard. "This is where I said I'd plant you a lemon tree. You always wanted one, didn't you?" He pointed at the shallow pit he'd dug months ago during a short-lived attempt at gardening. "Turns out it's the perfect size." "No, Tyler, please." He didn't strike her. He didn't shout. He just pushed. And then the dirt rained down. Ellie's screams were muffled almost instantly. Her fingernails clawed at dry earth, and her chest burned with panic. In those suffocating moments, memories flashed like gunfire. Bandaging a boy in a dusty tent, watching Tyler sleep on her lap as a toddler, holding her husband's cold hand after the mining accident. Then, darkness. Out by the hill, far from the house, Dusty stood as if frozen. His ears twitched. He took one step forward, then another. The air shifted. Something ancient moved inside him. The ground had spoken. Dusty turned and galloped, not away, but toward the place where something very wrong had just happened. And the wind, long silent in Redwood Hollow, began to howl. The wind that tore through Redwood Hollow that night wasn't just weather. It was a reckoning. Dust swirled across the dirt roads and rattled the brittle windows of shuttered homes. It howled through the twisted branches of pecan trees and screamed down forgotten alleys like the town itself was trying to speak after decades of silence. Dusty ran straight through it. He wasn't wild in the way people thought of Mustangs, unruly, dangerous, stubborn. He was purposeful, focused. His hooves pounded against cracked earth. His ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the house that reeked of death and silence. Something was wrong. Something was buried. He slammed into the back gate hard enough to splinter it. Tyler, drunk and passed out in his room, didn't stir. Dusty didn't care. He thundered across the yard, skidding to a stop near the patch of overturned dirt beneath the pecan tree. And then he started to dig. Hoof after hoof, he struck the ground, sending dirt flying in clumps. His breathing was ragged. He didn't whinny, didn't scream, just dug. Something ancient pulsed through him. Instinct, maybe, or memory, or something more. From the house next door, Jean Holloway stirred. She'd fallen asleep in her recliner again, Bible on her lap and a fan humming weakly by the window. It was the sound, the rhythm of hooves on dirt that woke her. She squinted through her blinds, expecting maybe a dogfight or coyotes. What she saw instead was a wild Mustang furiously digging like a beast possessed, sweat shining on his coat, muscles rippling with each strike of his legs. She gasped. Jane grabbed her flashlight and rushed out, robe flapping, hair unbrushed. "Dusty!" she called. "Dusty! What on earth?" But then she saw the dirt, the hole, and the hand. It was small and pale, fingers curled inward like petals, reaching up through the earth. Jean screamed. Within minutes, the Holloway porch light snapped on, and so did the McCoys. Eli, their 9-year-old boy, had already been half awake. He heard Jean scream and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, something's wrong at Miss Ellie's." Maria McCoy grabbed her phone and dashed outside. Her husband, Caleb, a former Army mechanic now running the auto shop, followed with a shovel in hand. They didn't need an explanation. Neighbors came from every direction. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years, now drawn together by instinct, guilt, and the unmistakable dread of something awful. Will, the retired farrier, dropped to his knees beside Dusty and picked up digging where the horse left off. "Easy, boy," he muttered. "We're here now." It took all of them, clawing with hands, shovels, even a broken garden rake. The dirt gave way slowly, resisting as though trying to keep its secret. Then Ellie's face appeared, blue lips, closed eyes, skin dusted in grit and death. "Move!" Jean shouted. "I was a nurse 30 years. Back up!" She tilted Ellie's chin, cleared her mouth, felt for breath. Come on, girl." A twitch, then a gasp, then a rattling, ragged cough as Ellie's body jerked back to life. Maria collapsed to her knees and sobbed. Caleb ran to the truck and called 911. Will placed a hand on Dusty's neck and whispered, "You did it, boy. You saved her." Dusty didn't move. He just stood there, watching Ellie like a sentinel carved from stone. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. Ellie was loaded in, weak and bruised, but breathing. The paramedics tried to wave Dusty away. He didn't budge. They started the engine. Dusty trotted beside them. The EMT in the passenger seat stared out the window, mouth half open. "Is that horse following us?" "He's not letting her go," the driver muttered, adjusting the sirens. At the hospital, nurses stared as Dusty planted himself outside the emergency room entrance. He wouldn't enter, but he wouldn't leave either. He paced a tight circle, nostrils flaring, occasionally lifting his head to the night sky as if listening for something. Back in town, Tyler woke up groggy, confused. He looked out the window and saw nothing but the broken gate swinging in the breeze. He didn't panic, not yet. It would be hours before Sheriff Delaney, tipped off by Caleb, came knocking. "You're under arrest for attempted murder," the sheriff said. Tyler didn't resist. Just blinked slowly, like someone waking from a bad dream that hadn't yet ended. By noon, the whole town knew. They came in waves. Neighbors who'd kept their blinds closed, folks who had ignored the shouting, the strange bruises, the loneliness in Ellie's eyes. Now, they stood at Jean's fence or gathered near the hospital steps, whispering. I always thought something was off. Poor Ellie. God, we should have said something. Dusty remained outside the hospital for 2 days. When Ellie finally opened her eyes, the first thing she whispered was his name. The local paper ran a front-page headline, The Guardian Mustang. Wild horse saves woman buried alive. Photos of Dusty circulated online. A freelance journalist from Reno called Jean for an interview. A TikTok teen posted a shaky video of the Mustang outside the ER. Within a week, people were calling him a hero, a miracle. But Ellie knew better. Dusty wasn't just a hero, he was a witness, a messenger, a creature of wind and instinct who had done what no human dared to. He broke the silence, and Redwood Hollow would never be able to pretend again. The courthouse in Carson County hadn't seen this many people in decades. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered into microphones. Locals who had never once cared for courtrooms now stood in their Sunday best, necks craned, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, the woman who had come back from the grave. Ellie Rhodes walked slowly, every step deliberate, her cane tapping against the tile with the steady rhythm of determination. Bruises still shadowed her neck. Her frame was thin, and her hands trembled slightly. But her eyes, God, her eyes were clear, calm, sharp like the desert wind. Beside her, Sheriff Delaney kept pace, nodding to the crowd. Inside the courtroom, Jean Holloway gripped a handkerchief in both hands. Maria and Caleb sat with Eli, who had drawn a crayon sketch of Dusty and pinned it to his chest like a badge. Will the farrier leaned against the back wall, arms folded, watching. And outside, just past the courthouse steps, Dusty waited under a cottonwood tree, his head high, his body still, as if he knew this wasn't over yet. Tyler sat in the defendant's chair, wearing a wrinkled county jumpsuit. His face was drawn, pale, eyes bloodshot. He didn't look at his mother when she entered. Didn't flinch when the judge read the charges. Attempted murder, aggravated elder abuse, intent to conceal a body. The words fell heavy, like stones dropped into a dry well. The prosecutor outlined the case with clinical precision. The years of verbal torment, the isolation, the hole in the backyard, the Mustang's frantic digging, the rescue. But it was Ellie's voice that brought the silence. She stood, holding a paper in one hand. A letter Tyler had written her when he was 10 years old, the same one she used to keep folded in her pocket like a shield. I don't come here to speak of anger, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. I come to speak of silence. She looked at the jury, at the judge, then finally at her son. For years, I lived with the ghost of the boy who promised to take me to the ocean. I raised him alone after his father died in that mine. I wiped his fevered brow. I sat through his suspensions. I bailed him out of more trouble than I care to count, and somewhere in that storm, I lost him. She paused, swallowing. But I never stopped loving him, not even when he laid hands on me, not even when he filled that grave. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom. Ellie continued, I don't ask you to forgive what he did. I ask you to see the man beneath the rage, to understand what neglect and grief and addiction can do when they go untreated for too long. She turned to the judge. Please, don't just punish him. Help him. Make him face what he did, yes, but don't throw away what's left of the boy who once promised me a horse. There was silence for several moments. Then the judge leaned forward. In light of the severity of the crime and the emotional testimony provided by the victim, he said. "The court hereby sentences Tyler Rhodes to 15 years in state custody, with mandatory enrollment in a mental health rehabilitation program for the duration of his sentence." Whispers spread through the room. Ellie exhaled and sat, folding the letter neatly into her lap. Outside, a small crowd had gathered near Dusty. Children stood beside their parents. An elderly couple from the edge of town brought flowers. Someone left a note tied to the tree. "You saved her when we didn't." Later that week, a strange letter made its way into every mailbox in Redwood Hollow. No return address, no signature. Just a single sentence typed in bold, "A horse saved her." What have we ever saved? It sparked something. At Father Nolan's church, usually half empty on Sundays, pews were now filled. He delivered a sermon not on sin, but on courage, on standing up when it's hard, on speaking when it's uncomfortable. "We don't need to be Dusty to do good," he said. "But we do need to stop pretending we didn't hear the screams." At the end of the service, Ellie stood beside Dusty just outside the chapel. She wore a plain dress and a shawl, and she carried no cane that day. "I don't need your pity," she told the crowd, voice even. "What I needed was your voice, your knock on my door, your question, even if it felt rude." She glanced down at Dusty, then back up. "The dirt didn't kill me. The silence almost did." There were tears in more eyes than not. Jean took Ellie's hand. Maria hugged her. Caleb gave Dusty a respectful nod. Something shifted that afternoon, as if a crack had opened in the shell that had long encased Redwood Hollow, and through it, light poured in. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something close. And standing watch at the edge of it all was a Mustang who never left, never spoke, never judged, only acted when no one else would. The winter sun rose over Redwood Hollow like a soft breath, barely warming the frost-dusted rooftops. A hush blanketed the town, a hush that no longer meant fear, but reflection. Ellie Rhodes sat on the edge of her hospital bed, the morning light catching the deep lines in her face. Her body was healing, slowly, but it was her mind that had carried the heavier weight. A nurse knocked lightly. "Miss Rhodes? There's a whole mailbox of letters for you. More came in this morning." Ellie chuckled under her breath. "Tell 'em I'm not running for mayor," she muttered, reaching for the small wooden box where she kept Tyler's childhood note. She opened it and read again. "One day, Mom, I'll buy you a horse, and we'll ride to the ocean like you always wanted." Tears welled, not from pain, but from the piercing ache of something unfinished, something still beating in her despite everything. She held the paper close to her heart. Dusty, now a familiar sight to the whole town, stood just outside the hospital fence, his breath fogging in the cold. He hadn't left since the night Ellie was brought in. He paced sometimes, nudging at the gate. Other times he simply stood still, silent, sentinel, sacred. Inside, the townsfolk stirred. At the town hall, Father Nolan stood before a gathering of neighbors, hands clasped, face weathered with both grief and hope. "Redwood Hollow has been quiet too long," he began. "And when a horse does what we were too afraid to, that's not just a miracle, it's a reckoning." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jean Holloway, dressed in her blue coat and Sunday hat, stood. "I saw it, the way he pawed at the dirt like he knew. Dusty didn't just save Ellie, he shamed us into remembering who we're supposed to be." Will, the former farrier, added, "We stood by. We heard things, we knew, and we did not act. That ends today." There, in the quiet of the meeting room, they made a decision. Not to forget, not to bury the shame, but to build something from it. Something real. 3 weeks later, Ellie returned home in a borrowed wheelchair, her legs still stiff but her spirit sharper than ever. As the pickup pulled up beside her home, she gasped. There it was. Not a grave, not a crime scene, but a garden. Where she had been buried alive, the neighbors had planted wildflowers, paintbrush, sage, milkweed, and at the center a bench carved with her initials and Tyler's. Behind it stood a cross, not of religion, but of memory, made of oak and burnished steel. A brass plaque below read, "Here, silence was broken, and life began again." Dusty stood beside it, almost reverently. Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. You did this?" she asked, voice trembling. Jean stepped forward. "We did, because you didn't give up, and that horse wouldn't let us forget." Ellie wasn't the same after the trial, and neither was the town. Each Sunday, she sat on the garden bench. Children came to sit with Dusty, pet him gently, feed him apple slices. Teenagers whispered confessions beside him. War veterans touched his mane and said nothing, and he seemed to understand. Eli McCoy, the boy who once peeked through his bedroom blinds, now came every afternoon with his sketch pad. One day, he gave Ellie a drawing, her and Dusty, standing on a hill, sunsetting behind them. "You're a superhero now," he said, grinning. Ellie smiled softly. "Nah, sweetheart, I was just the lady who needed saving." The transformation spread. Old garages were painted over with murals. The library reopened. Sheriff Hagan started a new outreach program for trauma victims. Even Jean began volunteering at the senior center. And through it all, Dusty remained. He never wore a halter, never allowed anyone to ride him. But he was always there, an unbroken Mustang who somehow found his way to broken people. One crisp afternoon, Ellie hobbled up the narrow trail that wound behind her house. Dusty followed behind, his hooves silent on the earth. They reached the ridge. From there, you could see the town, the newly painted rooftops, the glint of sun off church windows, the winding path through the memorial garden. It looked almost like peace. Ellie turned to Dusty, her breath misting. "You didn't just save me," she whispered. "You gave this town back its soul." Dusty stepped closer, his soft muzzle touching her shoulder. They stood together as the wind moved through the desert sage below, neither needing another word. And when Ellie turned to go, Dusty followed, his shadow stretched long beside hers, like a promise never broken.